Hello, colleagues, and welcome to week 2 of Assessment and Remediation of Early Reading Difficulties. I want to first take us back and always connect us to the assessment process, where we're always really sort of thinking about where a student is at and really using information that we have from multiple data points to be able to think about a specific plan that we have using both our formative and summative data. And then what instruction do we think will be necessary for students? And then what's that practice that we can again observe and watch and then identify again. So this process is critically important. And as we move ahead, we need to think about the different areas in literacy that we need to assess as we're looking at collectively at the whole child. For our purposes, we'll be thinking about specific areas of literacy to assess. So initially, we'll really want to be thinking about oral language of the student. So we know that oral language truly impacts how students interact with one another. It impacts how they take in language and then how they produce language. And so a lot of student processing and really thinking about information stems from oral language, which really develops from the time of birth, but that's something we really want to think critically about. So although we are not speech and language pathologists, we really want to consider, as we're having conversations with students, how they take information in and how do they produce language in responding back to you or to your peers. So you want to think about their articulation and their sentence structure and really the syntax of their language. So you really want to always be aware of that. And as you're really engaging with a student, you're just sort of maybe taking some anecdotal notes and things you might notice about the student so that you can have additional information as you're thinking about how they interact in literacy based on what you notice about their oral language. In addition, their vocabulary. So what types of words do they use? What's their word choice? How do they understand as you're engaging with them? So that's the first area we really want to just sort of take a step back and notice. And then again, we want to think about concepts of print. So as they engage in literacy activities, they've been exposed or hopefully exposed to literacy situations through their entire lives. So as we think about their interactions really with that in that logographic stage where they notice restaurant signs or just sort of connect with some type of print and knowing that it has meaning. And then from there, what do they identify with a text? So what do their book handling skills look like? How do they identify with knowing how to hold a text or how to engage in possibly reading a text? Do they look at the pictures and form some type of meaning? Do they hold the book properly? Do they understand that the text works from sort of a opening the text and turning the pages correctly? So those types of behaviors are things that we truly want to observe as we first engage with our young learners to see where they're at in that particular process. Then we want to think about a student's phonological awareness. So where are they at in understanding that within the spoken word that there's individual phonemes or sounds, and how would they manipulate language? So how can they manipulate words, in rhyming or things that sound the same? What do they notice about them? Do they notice words that sound the same in the beginning or sound the same in the end? So how do they engage with oral language and just sort of that manipulation of sounds? And then we want to think about their phonemic awareness, their understanding that truly speech is made up of sentences, and sentences are made up of words, and words are made up of smaller units of sounds, and then finally individual sounds. So Definitely phonological awareness and phonemic awareness are related to one another, and they're the foundational skills that students require as they engage in literacy and in language. And then finally, we want to think about their phonics ability. And so how do they correlate phonemes or sounds to letters or graphemes? So that phonics is a place where we begin to see students connect those letters and sounds together. And we want to note their progress so that as they're engaging with the process of reading itself, where are they within that particular process? And we want to assess the student's actual reading ability. So in reading, there are various tasks that happen simultaneously. It's really a balance of many processes for a student to actually create some type of comprehending or understanding. And so we want to note what a student is taking away from a text. And so we want to think about that in conversations that we have with them, and we can assess that in multiple ways. Also, their listening comprehension, how well are they at taking information away from a text or a story when the print is not presented to them. So sometimes students have really great comprehension of stories and are able to talk deeply about a story, but it's actually the reading process itself, those embedded skills that interfere with a student's ability to comprehend a text. In reading, we want to think about their fluency. How are they at putting the language together so that fluency can support the comprehension, so that we can be sure that they're understanding that process. And somewhere in there, there's sight words, because we know that sight words are not sounded out phonetically. So how are students able to take on that visual information and apply what they know for sight words in the actual process of reading itself? And finally, we want to think about writing. And so writing is really a core skill that lives right alongside reading. It's that reciprocal process. So as we're really thinking about what students understand about literacy, we want to look both at reading and writing, because writing can be a door into their reading process in seeing what they take away and what they understand about letters and sounds. And so there are many ways that we can use the writing process, even with drawings or illustrations, to see what kids are being able to show us in their literacy development. And then in the writing process itself, how are students at thinking about topics they want to write about? What is their fluency like in writing? So are they able to construct letters fluently, words fluently, and sentences, or even draw fluently to create a message? So sometimes some of our beginning readers have a lot of difficulty even just constructing meaning from pictures, and so they need some additional support or intervention in how to create a visual image so that they can convey meaning in their writing. And so their development across a piece of writing, are they able to come up with some types of strategies to be able to elaborate? And so some of those initial steps that we know students, beginning literacy students, do is being able to elaborate in their pictures. Can they show us additional meaning? Do they have some strategies for that? And then essentially, when they're able to construct written passages or sentences, how are they able to come up with strategies to be able to elaborate their writing and add more details? And then as we look across a piece, does a student have a beginning, middle, and end? Do we have some type of story development that happens for students? And then finally, we think about the conventions. So are they spelling conventionally? Are they adding sight words that they might know. So there's so many different steps for students in that developmental trajectory. And in this week's reading, you want to really think about that developmental trajectory, because in order to assess students effectively, you have to sort of understand where they are at in that particular process so that you can see what they're doing well. What's their understanding? What's their theory? And what's their philosophy of reading? As we engage with students, sometimes I want to caution you that this conversation of readiness comes into play when it comes to students' literacy development. They just aren't ready. They aren't ready to take on the print. But the research clearly shows us that students begin their literacy development at birth with oral language development, engaging with some type of meaning from visual representation. So students are already practicing their readiness skills, and it's sometimes their exposure impacts students in what they're able to take on and what they're able to do. And so we want to be really careful when we think about statements that say, he or she cannot make progress, or that they're not ready, because we can clearly identify with different steps in what students are able to take on, even from their visual representation. And we can choose steps for instruction that support students across that continuum. And if we come with the philosophy of readiness, then we are actually inhibiting their ability to make progress in literacy as we are waiting for them to catch up. So really, there isn't a catch up. It's an additional exposure. It's additional time. It's an additional instruction. It's an additional way of meeting a student where they're at. And it's only through assessment and observation and clearly annotating and noting where students are at in this process that we're going to be able to address their specific needs and really think about what are those barriers impacting a student's ability to make progress. So whatever those barriers are, that's where we really need to reach and meet students. So as you're thinking this week in your reading and your learning, there'll be many challenges that will be addressed in the reading. What are some difficulties for students that we notice? But we want to be careful that we do not really come into this process with a thinking that students are ready or not ready to learn. And sometimes as we think about these difficulties, students who are presenting so many challenges in the reading process and what they're able to connect with or not, sometimes we look towards instructional programs. And I want to caution you that programs or different sequences, some of them can really address students' needs and some of them simply do not. So we need to be able to have as many strategies as possible to address individualized students' needs, and we need to balance some of the things that are addressed in literacy programs in order to meet their individualized needs, because not every learner comes into every situation with the same exposure to literacy processes or the same exposure to language or vocabulary. And so we really want to think about that assessment process to be able to support all learners moving forward. So with the mindset that every student is ready to engage in literacy activities, we can think about what it really means for our beginning readers to look like they're actually reading. So sometimes our students are simply reading with pictures, right? They're reading the pictures, they're taking on meaning, they're using that visual image to be able to construct some meaning for what's actually happening in the text. And eventually they will read without pictures. So they'll be able to have practiced long enough to be able to use the visual information presented phonetically and use their phonological awareness and their phonemic awareness skills to be able to connect letters and sounds, and they'll be able to put that visual information together in a synthesized way that they'll be able to read without the pictures. However, I want to caution you not to remove the pictures too early, because students are simply using them as a scaffold, and scaffolds are temporary but often necessary. So our students clearly need the pictures to help support them with the visual information that they don't have the ability to use without some type of support. And always remembering that the door into literacy for reading is always writing. So many of our students will be constructing pictures, and we will be teaching them. So sometimes we need to give them drawing lessons, so they'll move beyond a stick figure stage. So for students who haven't had a lot of exposure, we teach them how to draw, and then they'll begin to draw and label and use their phonemic awareness skills and apply phonics to be able to construct some initial labeling, so that we can see that they're moving across that continuum and really labeling beginning letter sounds. And we will notice that labeling really and thinking about letters and sounds really comes with a trajectory, right? So when we think about them connecting letters and sounds within words, oftentimes they're really only able to identify with that beginning sound because that's what they hear first. And then essentially they hear that ending sound next, right? And then that medial sound is much more difficult for them to be able to attain because it's typically vowels, and vowel sounds are much harder for them to be able to apply and be able to hear within a word, inside of a word. And so we want to be able to use those scaffolds and think about instructing our students and thinking about that instructional pattern or the sequence of instructional skills and strategies that we want to engage students in that really support that trajectory for students as we're assessing them and noticing what students need in their literacy development. So when students are actually engaging in the reading process and all of the strategies that they need to apply and the skills they need to attain, the reading process is very, very complex. So our early readers need to do many things. So they need to be able to gain control over a text and be able to synthesize all of the process itself to be able to think about the direction of the print and using those sources of information, that MSV that you learned about last week, really thinking about language and thinking about the visual information from the letters and sounds and using the picture and being able to think about the syntax of their work, to be able to be strategic in this particular process. And so while they are doing that, they're sort of attending to certain types of information, searching for certain types of information while they're predicting and cross-checking information. So does the visual information match what they think would happen in the word moving forward? And are they confirming that with their ability and knowledge of phonics? And then ultimately self-correcting when things aren't going well for them as a reader until they become fluid and automatic. So our goal is really for students to become automatic, and automaticity is really important for students. So are they able to be fluent with knowing what letters and sounds correspond quickly? Are they able to fluently and rapidly and automatically be able to say their sight words so that they can put words together and be able to read? But a lot of times, many students use that balance or that synthesis of information to be able to engage in the reading process. So it's not just letters and sounds in isolation. It's the predicting and cross-checking and thinking about language and what would make sense and what's happening in the story and the scaffold of the picture that helps them unlock a lot of the visual information. So you need to be careful on how much phonics or skills you are applying, because you want to balance that students use the information to what makes sense and what's really happening in the story, because many of our words don't work phonetically and they need to be able to use all of their skills as a process to be able to engage in this work, and really monitor themselves as they're reading to be able to really think about all of this type of work. And they need to be able to infer and sort of think about, like, what's going to make sense, what's going to happen next, even when it comes to inferring the structure. So many times the structure of a text supports students in addition to the pictures. So some of our beginning readers really have a structure that supports them. I am a cat, I am a dog, right? And so the picture really supports them. Or look at the dog, look at the cat. And so they need to infer, what's that structure going to be like? Because I know that it's been the same pattern in the last few pages. And then I know it's probably going to be like that again. And then how do I use that visual information that I have to be able to predict what's going to happen and apply the skills that I know? And then essentially they're visualizing the story to be able to gain comprehension and information. They're determining in informational text what's important, what's not important, as they look across a page with a lot of information presented to them, to be able to analyze and really synthesize as they become fluent and avid readers. So this is a very complex process, but really begins sort of collectively as a whole, and our assessment process really helps us to be able to tease out information and be able to think about, what's this student's philosophy of reading? What do they think is important? Are they not balancing? Are they just thinking about meaning? Some of our students will read the pictures and sort of make up the story and not attend to any of the visual information from the text and the letters and the sounds and the words. And so we know that meaning is something that they rely heavily on. But then, are they only relying on visual information? So some of our students won't use the meaning from the text, or they won't use the pictures enough. And so they're simply corresponding letters and sounds, and they're not putting that process together. Or are they just saying words in isolation and not fluently putting them together so they can create some type of comprehension for themselves as readers? So we use the assessment process to really be able to think about, where are these students? What are the challenges for them? And what do they think is important? So just because we've taught them and modeled for them what's important, what have they taken on and what have they internalized? So many times they internalize what they're really good at. They use that a lot, and they sort of neglect what is difficult for them. So our instruction really needs to balance what they do well and how they use what they do well to support what they're not really using and doing so well. So that balance of instruction really helps us to support them in really showing them some quick and frequent lessons that supports maybe visual information or corresponding letters and sounds, to really balancing the work that they're doing well. So as you're thinking about the challenges for readers and thinking about an instructional plan that makes sense to them, as you're choosing text that scaffolds what they need, choosing books that really scaffold sight words that they might be able to know. So what are the things that you can do to make the text accessible to them as they're working on skills and strategies that are more complex? Have a great week.